Maintenant, cette séance, bienvenue dans la réunion numéro 104.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 104 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport and Infrastructure and Communities, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, March 7, 2023. The committee is meeting to discuss its study on the high-frequency rail projects. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application.
Feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to our interpreters and cause serious injury. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece that is worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite all participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Colleagues, before we begin today and I introduce you all to our witnesses, I would just like to take a moment to once again put forward the budget that was tentatively approved at our previous meeting. I'd like to put that forward for consideration. All of you have received a copy. And I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to adopt the revised budget. Oh, changes to the budget. Okay. Yes. Yes. Changes to the budget. Just one line, right? Yes, Dr. Lewis. Seeing no objection. Okay, it is so adopted. Yes, Mr. Backrack.
If I could just, Mr. Chair, express my appreciation to the clerk for making the timely change as requested. It's much appreciated.
I second that. Thank you, Mr. Backrack.
We look forward to the barbecue in your backyard.
I note we're not spending the night, so you can't sleep over.
So, colleagues, appearing before us in the first hour, we have Monsieur Pierre-Olivier Pinault, professeur, Chair in Energy Sector Management, HEC Montréal, par vidéoconférence.
By video conference.
Robert Eaton, Senior Director, Government Affairs. Welcome and thank you for being here, sir. And from the city of Drummondville, la ville de Drummondville, nous avons Stéphanie et Thomas Roux, directeur.
And Thomas Roux, Director of the Mayor's Office. Welcome, both of you. We shall begin with Mr. Pinault. Mr. Pinault, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It is an honor for me to testify before the committee today. I am a fervent supporter of the TRAN. I'm an expert in energy policy, and so I'm not a specialist per se on trains, but I look at the energy consumption and energy policy in Canada, and I unfortunately note that petroleum products is consumption in the transport sector is huge and is not decreasing over time because Canadians are short of alternatives to using cars. A train is essential. Canada was built thanks to the railways, and we have the impression that it's part of our past, our glorious past that we're proud of, but actually trains must be the foundation of the future transportation in Canada, because it is owing to trains that we are able to inhabit Canada and all its regions in an ecological way by reducing our consumption of energy, and economically because the train is less costly. A train is less costly simply because if you had come to Ottawa if I come to Ottawa by car today to testify, it would have been, I don't have a car, but I would have been able to be reimbursed for the kilometers according to the allowance for 70 cents per kilometer, and it's 200 kilometers from Montreal to Ottawa, so the return trip would have cost $280 for my employer to offset the cost of my Montreal-Ottawa trip, $280. A train ticket would have cost only $120 for the return trip. So that alone illustrates to what degree automobiles are costly compared to trains. And of course, a train pays for its railway, but the $280 I paid does not include the cost of the roads. The roads were built and paid for elsewhere out of additional budgets that are on top of the cost covered by individuals when they use their automobile. Of course, the alternative by plane would have cost even more, and from an environmental viewpoint, greenhouse gas emissions are even greater with an airplane, an automobile, and much less with a train. When we know about the priorities that are ours in Canada in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we have a convergence with the train for the reduction of costs, reducing greenhouse gases, and increasing the productivity of individuals. Because, needless to say, had I come to Ottawa by car, I would have had to drive and I would have lost 4 hours of my life, 2 hours on the way in and 2 hours on the way out. But on a train, I could have worked or slept or done recreation, and the same thing if you go to Toronto to use that corridor with high frequency, or between Calgary and Edmonton. Instead of wasting your time in a car and wasting the productivity in a car, Canadians will be able to be productive or enjoy recreational activities or rest in the train. This is an essential factor to the quality of life, in addition to saving money and, of course, having reduced greenhouse gases. The last point I would like to mention is that a train is becoming electrified much more easily than airplanes or cars. So in the medium term, we'll be able to electrify modes of transportation, and it will be much easier to electrify trains than to electrify cars or airplanes, which will cause Canadian society to gain not only in terms of money, but ease and well-being and a better environment. So I am pleased about the possibility of having a high-frequency train, and I find that in 2024, it's unfortunate that we need to have this conversation. We ought to have had a high frequency train for years, but it's never too late to do things right. So I hope that this high frequency train will soon be created, and I place all my support behind this project. Mr. Pinault, thank you. Before we continue, of course, we need unanimous consent to enable our witnesses to deliver the opening remarks.
Witnesses deliver their opening remarks before we move on to the vote. The vote has been called. I have unanimous consent. Thank you very much, colleagues. Donc, la mairesse, Madame la mairesse.
So the mayor, over to you now. 5 minutes, please. Chair, members of parliament, thank you for inviting me to speak today. Drummondville has a voice regarding the high-frequency trains owing to my presence here. I'd like to say a few words about Drummondville, the 14th largest city in Quebec. It's a central city in the Centre du Quebec region, equally distant from Montreal, Quebec, along the south shore of the St. Lawrence. Over the past decade, it has seen annual increases in its population that are substantial and has undergone continual development. An example of its vitality and its role as an economic powerhouse, the Drummondville community continues its boom. Among the many assets, Drummondville has a strategic geographic location at the crossroads of major highways and right in the center of the most densely populated part of Quebec. In fact, our city is 90 minutes from 75% of Quebec's population. The increasing exchanges between Drummondville and major cities increases the importance of issues of mobility. In this project that we're looking at today, Drummondville has to position itself and assert that it is the right location to play the role of a hub in the deployment of intercity transport solutions worthy of the 21st century. In fact, concerning the HFT, our city and our entire committee supports the project, first put forward by Via Rail, and has for a long time. Nevertheless, and this is very important to be kept in mind, the city's support to this project has always been and remains conditional on maintaining, improving, and upgrading the services along the south shore of the St. Lawrence in a context where Drummondville's facilities would be called upon to act as a major hub between Montreal and Quebec City, in the same way that Kingston plays that role between Toronto and Montreal. One of your witnesses, Mr. Barriot, emphasized the importance of not neglecting South Shore passengers. The relevance of the hub fits into concrete and justified logic. Drummondville's population and also a large part of the south of the St. Lawrence would then be connected to Ontario and Toronto, being able to connect to the HFT to Montreal. Bringing this high-frequency train into service would and it should not be done to the detriment of the areas currently served. And in fighting climate change, we think that it's an essential model for bringing in the HFT and the improving of services on the South Shore that go along with it. Convinced of the relevance of this project, the cities of Drummondville and Trois-Rivières have agreed together to support it. Rather than the North Shore or the South Shore, we have chosen North Shore and South Shore. And Via Rail has also rapidly signed on to this orientation that an eventual route along the North Shore where dedicated rail lines could be used should not be done without taking into account the South Shore, Drummondville, where every day dozens of people use the train towards Quebec City or Montreal. And in August 2016, the CEO of Via Rail confirmed that the development of the HFT would result in a repositioning of the strategy for passenger transport on the South Shore by creating a hub in Drummondville for intercity transportation. At the same time, Via Rail announced that between Montreal and Quebec City, the daily frequencies would gradually be raised to 8 trains in each direction over a period of 2 to 3 years. So far, that commitment has not been implemented. In addition to the problem of frequency, we face issues of the amplitude of the schedules and reliability. Furthermore, the current results are not very conclusive. Since the rails belong to CN, the priority is given to freight trains, and there, as a result, there are long waits on sidelines, which causes issues for travelers. And also, there's the number of users. In conclusion, we wish to reassert our will to and the collaboration of Drummondville in this high priority issue for Drummondville elected officials, the municipal administration, and especially the entire population of our region. Of course, I will be available to answer your questions. Thank you for having listened to me. Thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Eden, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, sir.
Merci, Monsieur President, and members of the committee. It's great to be
Thank
here.
you, Chair.
Amtrak was created by the U.S. Congress in 1970. The company is operated and managed as a private corporation with the federal government owning controlling interest. By law, our mission is to provide efficient and effective intercity passenger rail mobility consisting of high-quality service that is trip time competitive with other intercity travel options. In fiscal year 23, we served more than 40 routes, operated almost 300 trains a day, and the Amtrak workforce delivered 29 million passengers to 524 stations in the US and Canada. We expect our fiscal year 24 ridership to match or exceed our pre-pandemic levels of 32.5 million passengers. And by 2024, we hope to serve 66 million customers a year. That's 66 million trips that won't strain already congested highways and airlines. It means travel time for those passengers will be usable and productive. Our intercity service takes 3 forms. The Northeast Corridor service line provides fast, frequent service up to speeds of 150 miles per hour along mostly Amtrak-owned line. We shared it with commuters and also freight trains between Boston and Washington, D.C. While ticket revenues significantly exceed operating costs, the federal government as well as state governments fund most of the capital projects along that service. The long-distance line provides daily, in 2 cases, 3 times a week service along routes that are at least 750 miles in length and depend on annual federal appropriations for operation. And the third type of service, the state-supported service line, which provides service along shorter corridor routes outside of the Northeast Corridor and is pursuant to contracts with the relevant states. The states partner with Amtrak to provide the funding for their service and determine daily frequency and other operational attributions. Both the state-supported and long-distance train typically operate over tracks owned by other railroads. We call them host railroads. Federal law guarantees Amtrak access to the host railroad's infrastructure for compensation based on an incremental cost and requires that Amtrak trains receive preference in dispatching over freight trains. We believe that important and expanded state-supported service throughout the U.S. and Canada is key to our long-term growth. Some of our state-supported services have similar characteristics to Canada's planned high-frequency service. Several have 10 or more round trips a day. A few operate over rail lines used almost exclusively by passenger rail. And on several routes, trains operate at speeds of 110 miles per hour. Our state-supported routes, like the Amtrak Cascades from Eugene, Oregon to Vancouver, British Columbia, The Chicago to St. Louis Lincoln service in the Midwest and the Virginia service in the Southeast continue to make investments over time, have caused frequency, reliability, and quality of service to improve over time. Consider the state-supported service in Virginia, which began in 2009 with funding for a single daily round trip. Today, Virginia supports 8 daily round trips between Washington, D.C. and various endpoints of the state. And as frequencies were added, ridership grew. 10 years ago, the Virginia service carried fewer than 900,000 passengers a year, whereas last year, the same service carried 1.3 million travelers, a remarkable 48% increase following that investment. This growth in ridership has built support of transforming rail in Virginia, a state-led initiative that provides for 5 additional round trips per day by 2030, as well as increased reliability, greater convenience, and improved customer experience. And of course, the Northeast Corridor illustrates the value of high-frequency service even more clearly. Together, Amtrak's high-speed Acela trains and its conventional Northeast regional trains deliver hourly or better service during peak periods. Both routes are operationally profitable, and their combined ridership last year exceeded 12 million passengers, more than 40% of Amtrak's system-wide total. We greatly value the partnership with Canada. We look forward to continuing working closely with the Canadian government and other stakeholders, especially with our partner Via Rail, on issues like expanding pre-clearance that will improve cross-border service, and we would be delighted to see even more intercity passenger rail between our two countries, like the proposed connecting service between Detroit and Windsor. Thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eaton. Just a quick note to our witnesses for our first panel and those that have already joined us for our second panel. The lights that you see flashing mean that a vote's been called in the House of Commons. We are required to go vote. I'm required, per the regulations, to suspend the meeting to allow members to go vote. We can anticipate that we'll have everybody back here sometime between 11:50 and noon, so we appreciate your patience in the meantime. This meeting stands suspended until the vote is concluded. And we will begin our line of questioning today for our witnesses with you, Mr. Strahl. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to split my time with Mr. Lewis, and I want to use the beginning of my time just to move a motion that I tabled earlier this week regarding Lynx Airlines. So I will read that into the record, and then we can move ahead. So the motion reads that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, given that Lynx Air has filed for court protection from creditors, stating that, quote, the compounding financial pressures associated with inflation, fuel costs, exchange rates, cost of capital, regulatory costs, and competitive tension in the Canadian market have ultimately proven too steep a mountain for our organization to overcome. The committee invite the Minister of Transport, the Commissioner of the Competition Bureau, the National Airlines Council of Canada, and other witnesses to the committee deems relevant to discuss the state of airline competition in Canada, and that the committee report its findings to the House. So thank you, Mr. Chair. That's obviously been moved, but I would like to turn the time over to my colleague for further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Mr. Lewis,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much time, please, sir?
you have 4 minutes and 50 seconds.
4:50. Thank you to my colleague for sharing his time with me. The nice thing about votes is when we're waiting to vote, we get a chance to speak to some of the witnesses off record. So I just want to say thank you so much to the mayor for the conversation. And that conversation, just for the rest of the committee, it's had to do with an article down in right next door to my riding, Chatham, Kent, Leamington. It had to do with Roma, so the Rural Ontario Municipalities Association. And there was a lot of, there still is a lot of major concern with regard to the drainage. So I understand near 1 million acres of drainage between Toronto and Windsor. There's a fight because the railroads are not paying their fair share, so taxpayers will be on the hook. So thank you again, Mayor, for that. I'll switch gears over to the next news article I have from Tuesday, July 27, 2021, when then Minister Agbra came to the Windsor area, and the headline is Federal Transportation Minister says Windsor to Toronto will be phase 2 of high-frequency rail project, which in and of itself is exciting. Mr. Eaton, I listened to your testimony keenly, and I love the fact at the very end, you talked about Detroit to Windsor. And so, in your opinion, because this is phase 2, today for Amtrak, Detroit to Windsor, and you spoke about high-frequency rail up to 110 miles an hour, I understand, in the United States. What impact will it be if the Windsor to Toronto corridor doesn't get done for the folks that you're looking to move to Windsor? Because my concern is once you get to Windsor, you're kind of stagnant. Thoughts?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question, Mr. Minister. I think well, first of all, we're working very closely and very hard to establish that service between Windsor and Detroit. So I think even though without the high frequency corridor. So I think that connectivity will provide some utility. However, obviously, in my testimony, as we continue to invest in the services, increasing frequency, increasing speed, that will actually move more passengers back and forth between those two cities. So it's a starting point, and then you build on that starting point.
Well, thank you, sir. And I just go back to the mayor's opening comments, and she spoke about the strategic geographical location of Drummondville, and that very much is Essex County is very much Windsor, right? Geographical. And so when we see here that it's the second phase, what time frame do you believe that Amtrak, all the infrastructure, all the resources will quote unquote land in Windsor, so that we have an idea to be prepared to connect this back to the rest of the system?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair and committee member. We don't like to say timeframes because we know what happens, but I get in transportation. I can definitely give you a better idea, but our network development team is leaning into this. We actually have preliminary designs. We're talking with USCBP and CBSA about the design of the pre-clearance facility in Windsor. I understand there's motion on the Canadian side for funding for that project as well through Transport Canada. So we have both railroads, VIA and Amtrak, CBSA, CBP, as well as local government coalescing around this issue with all diligence to it. So don't have an exact timeline, but we can keep you abreast of the situation.
I'd appreciate that. That would be great. You kind of sounded like government when you said that you don't like to talk about timeframes. So that's respectable, and I appreciate your honesty. I want to talk briefly on. I mean, this project to date, I believe it to be true, has some pretty significant overruns, cost overruns. And I'm just curious, what does it look like in the States, in the United States? How is that budgeting, how is the forecasting been with regard to the success that the United States has had? And I know you mentioned a few jurisdictions that are very successful. How much overrun costs were there?
That, sir, I don't have any specific information on cost overruns. I know our network development and our state-supported departments work closely with the DOTs for planning and their forecasting and their annual budgets at the state level. It's actually an annual process in terms of incremental investment over time.
Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis. Next, we have Mr. Iacono. Mr. Iacono, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Iacono, the floor is yours.
Debate on the motion of my colleague across, Mrs. Straub.
Yes.
I heard Mr. Straub say the motion is moved, and I think he meant to put it on notice. Perhaps we could just get clarity?
Go ahead, Mr. Shaw.
So I apologize. I did put it on notice on Tuesday.
Yes.
Written notice. I wanted to move it in a public forum, but I'm okay with us moving on to we should have probably adjourned the debate prior to Mr. Lewis's questions, but I guess it's not a
From a
dilatory.
procedural standpoint, I just wanted to make sure we had the vote to adjourn debate on that for the public record. Are we
That's
all in
for
favor
clarity.
of doing that?
Agreed.
Seeing no opposition? So approved. Mr. Iacono, vous avez 6 minutes.
Mr. Iacono, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, and thank you all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Pino, could you share with us how the high-frequency train can benefit and assist so that the government can achieve its objectives for the environment?
I believe Mr. Iacono, malheureusement, il n'est plus là.
Unfortunately, Mr. Iacono, I'm afraid he's no longer there. He had to leave for other reasons. So do I lose those seconds that I used? I'll credit you the 20 seconds, so you have 6 minutes, Mr. Iacono. So should I start at 0? Very good. You're very kind. So perfect. So I'll go ahead with the next one.
Can you talk about the safety of passenger rail in Canada with HFR, increased passenger rail safety? So I would start with Mr. Eaton.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question, member of the committee. In terms of safety, I'm not a safety expert, so I would actually look to Via Rail and your host railroads to talk about safety. But however, I know in the U.S. and Canada, safety is primary importance, making sure that operations of trains are safe as well as the public.
Thank you. Is it fair to say that the Northeast Corridor shows that even in North America, higher or high-speed rail can succeed and flourish, actually being the dominant public transportation mode in terms of market share? This is the mode operating on electric energy that must have a large positive environmental and social economic impact by moving lots of people efficiently. Do you think that would be appropriate to have similar in Canada with what we're looking at doing between Quebec and the corridor?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question, Mr. Committee Member. We have demonstrated that the Northeast Corridor operationally is very successful. Our ticket revenue covers the cost of our operations. However, it takes vast amounts of capital funding for the infrastructure, not only for the implementation of it, but also the annual maintenance of it. So that being said, the U.S. government supports, as I said in my remarks, that infrastructure to benefit those of the public. There's a model for it here, also in the U.S. And Canada. So Canada could take the learning lessons from there and actually implement it here. But it does need support from the federal government.
Thank you. Madame Lacoste.
Ms. Lacoste.
Can you share with the committee how HRF will foster Canada's economic prosperity?
Well, among other things, by serving the North Shore well and also the South Shore, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the South Shore is quite densely populated. We believe that making a hub of Drummondville will arrange things so that the train will be more reliable and will also ensure that passengers will increasingly select that means of transportation. And of course, it's going to have impacts for Canada as a whole. When you ensure that it becomes a reliable or a viable alternative, then people will be there. There will be uptake, and people will give priority to that means of transport. So, along the same line of thinking, what would you say about the tourism aspect? What would be the impact for tourism? Needless to say, in major cities, there is a willingness or a more and more desire to go and settle in regional areas. So coming and settling in Drummondville, where right now they're served by the train, will enable people to attend shows in Montreal or Quebec City and return to Drummondville. The issue for the moment is the supply and the scheduling so that it cannot be done the same day. But ultimately, if that does happen, people will be able to come and settle in the region, and that will enhance our economic development, and they'll be able to maintain their ties with families and friends in the major cities. So I think in that way, we can better develop our regions. As you know, there's the whole battery sector that's coming to set up shop in Quebec, which is important for tourism, for the labor force, and also to be able to develop and achieve the objectives of alternatives for energy. Thank you.
When it comes to future of transportation and infrastructure, where do you believe governments, regardless of levels, should be investing in regard to moving people safely and efficiently?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Member, thank you for the question. Speaking as a former mayor who actually built a train station in my community in Central Washington, I think local government, state government, and federal government should be integral. Moving our people as well as our goods is very important in an efficient way. It's, as I said in my remarks, it's productive time. Whether and however you define productivity, whether you're sleeping with your grandchildren or actually moving men and women in the business sector back and forth so they can be productive is important. So I think from a society perspective, we all should be leaning into it.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Iacono.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Iacono. Now we have Mr. Bacelou Duval. Over to you. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here. I'd like to begin with Mr. Eaton from Amtrak. I have heard it said, perhaps you will be able to confirm that Amtrak trains, passenger trains in the USA, have priority over freight trains. Is that the case on all railways or only on those operated by Amtrak, or at the very least, is it also the case on railways that do not belong to Amtrak? Are there other trains that do not belong to Amtrak that circulate there? We'd like to understand how things operate there, because here it's the freight trains that have priority.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair and Mr. Member. Regarding preference, Amtrak does have preference on all of our routes that we do operate. That was part of our origination in 1970 when I spoke of that. In terms of other railroads, other passenger rail, commuter rail have different requirements and obligations, as well as enjoy different privileges in rail. But it's specific to Amtrak in terms of preference.
OK, donc c'est seulement Amtrak qui a pris.
So it's only Amtrak that has preference over freight, just your trains and not necessarily other trains. Does that have a substantial impact on the efficiency of your operations?
While we do enjoy preference, sometimes that is not always adhered to. So in terms of our preference, the better dispatching that we do have improves our performance and our efficiency and our reliability for our passengers. Did I answer your question?
Oui, merci, ça répond bien à ma question.
Yes, thank you. That answered my question. How much time do I have left, Chair? 4 minutes. Okay. So I'll start right away with Ms. Lacoste from Drummondville. I wish to thank you for being here today for the benefit of everyone at the table, because sometimes we have had people who have come to testify before the committee who mentioned that they would like, for example, to have a stop station in their city or like the trains to stop there. In the case of Drummondville, it's a different situation. Drummondville is on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River, where there is already a line and where the next train will not be coming. But what I'd like to know from Drummondville is, at present, what's anticipated is that the operations and the scheduling blocks will be managed by the new North Shore service. In other words, there'll be a private construction that will manage the schedule on the North Shore, but also the South Shore scheduling. So I'd like to hear you talk about how it's beneficial for the South Shore to have that scheduling managed by them. If it makes it possible for the passenger trains to have preference over the freight trains, then we are open to the idea, absolutely, because this is one of the major problems now regarding reliability, because freight trains on our railways that belong to Canadian National, those freight trains have priority, which means that passenger trains have to wait quite frequently, and this gives rise to interruptions or delays of service. So people are less trusting in that form of transportation and decide to use their cars. So what was promised in the past was really to create a hub in Drummondville to ensure that all the aspect of reliability and the scale of the scheduling for the trains could be made possible and have efficiency on both the South Shore and the North Shore, and make it possible to continue giving good service to those cities that are already served. Thank you, and I'll yield the rest of my time to my colleague. You have 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair. We will continue, Ms. Lacoste, because you talked about the hub, the famous crossroads of railway lines, which eventually will be able to use it to send out trains to other areas in Quebec, such as Montreal and other things, which would be an undeniable asset to the region's development. I'd like to hear you more on that. You talked about that in your opening remarks, but to what extent will this hub for railways be important or even essential in the economic development of the Drummondville region? And what steps have been taken by the city? Because you talked about certain commitments that were made in the past. Precisely as we were told, needless to say, the project on the North Shore in the south will develop in collaboration, and Drummondville acquired the necessary lands for the creation of the hub around the current railway station, and we also developed a whole plan for real estate around that station to make it a central point. So that being said, the city is ready to receive or welcome this hub, which was promised, or we were told also that there would be an increase in the number of trains and train departures. There are 5 now, and they talked about having it go up to 8. And the reason why it's important, as I said, Drummondville is an economic area that is dynamic, and we need a lot of labor, and we are looking to increase the whole tertiary motor sector here. We're talking about the battery sector, which is going to be set up in our area, and there are excellent opportunities and issues, and the train will enable us to bring in a qualified labor force from the major centers so that they'll be able to come and settle in the region where the quality of life is attractive for families. Yes, especially Drummondville. We know that a good place to live. Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. And finally, we have Mr. Backrack.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for contributing to this study. I'd like to start with Mr. Eaton and on the topic of comparing passenger rail in Canada to passenger rail in the United States. It seems that one of the key differences is this federal legislation that you described that gives Amtrak's passenger trains preference or priority on the tracks that it shares with freight trains. Could you talk about what it would look like in the United States if Amtrak did not have that federal legislation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Member, for that question. I think if we did not have that preference, conditions could be worse. But I want to preface that, or can finish up with that, in terms of we have a very strong relationship with our host railroads. Even though the statute was given to us during our formation in 1970, we've been working with that, and we strive to work with our host railroads to have open communication, to solve the issue on preference and on-time performance. We work together to identify areas where capital investment would benefit both freight and passenger. So I think it's very important that regardless of the foundation, the communication between passenger rail and freight exists, and you keep moving it forward.
Now, we've had Via Rail before our committee, and their leadership has cited statistics around on-time performance, that on the tracks that Via Rail owns, they can deliver 90+% on-time performance. On the tracks that Via Rail shares with freight traffic, it's down near 60%. So significantly less on-time performance. And of course, as the mayor has cited, that's a major challenge in terms of the dependability of passenger rail. Could you talk about the on-time performance of Amtrak, both on shared tracks and on the tracks that it owns?
Sure. Mr. Chair and Member, thank you for that question. And I think we have similar statistics on track that we own and track that we are hosted on. On the Northeast Corridor, we have a very high percentage of on-time performance. Last December, it was 81% on-time performance for the tracks that we own on the Northeast Corridor. And then when it goes to our long distance and state-supported services, the on-time performance does drop, and it ranges based on the host railroad, but also the region and type of service. So again, it's down anywhere from 89 down to the 60s.
In the recent Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration made a substantial investment in passenger rail in the United States. I believe over $60 billion. Proportionally, that would look like a $6 billion investment in Canada, which is many times more than Canada has been investing in passenger rail each year. What is that investment allowing Amtrak to do?
Mr. Chair, Member, thank you for the question. Rail in the United States receives $66 billion in the legislation that you're talking about. $22 billion of that came directly to Amtrak, so we're actually modernizing our fleet. We're actually buying all new train sets, modernizing our infrastructure so we can support passenger service. $44 billion went to the Federal Railroad Administration, and here it's key to administer grant programs and as well as additional corridors. That opportunity is allowing both passenger rail and freight rail to get together with the FRA, identify corridors that will be new, but also identify through service development plans where improvements need to be made to improve service.
My understanding is that the fleet you're replacing was put into service in the 1970s. Is that correct?
Before that, similar to Via Rail's fleet as well, in the 70s and the 60s. Yeah,
the 60s and 70s. Okay. And then turning to Madame Lacoste, la mairesse, you may be aware that I have a private member's bill that would create a federal law similar to in the United States that would give passenger trains priority on shared tracks. You mentioned that the weights that are involved on the tracks that serve your community are a big problem for passenger rail. Is that a law that you would support?
Effectivement, ça fait en
Yes,
sorte
indeed. It ensures that the people who work, who live in Drummondville and who have to travel to Montreal or Quebec City for their work will tend to want to take their car because they are too, they don't have train schedules that are suitable to their needs, or they're concerned that they might have to wait too long and not be able to arrive on time. So the result is that the service is not being used as much as it could be. There are a lot of people who, we're really in the center of Quebec, and there are people who live in Drummondville and who work in either Montreal or Quebec City. So we need to make sure that there is a reliability so that they can travel there once or twice a week to the major cities and go to the head office and come back to our city and to cover the region. As I would remind you, we're 90 minutes from 75% of Quebec's population. So this means that we are a central point within the province. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Backrack. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Eaton. Unfortunately, we have no further time to give. We have to give time for the next group of witnesses to share with us.
We'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow for our next group of witnesses to set up. This meeting stands suspended. welcome our witnesses in the second panel. Appearing before us, we have from Canadian National Railway, Mr. Huang TRAN. I hope I got that right. Very good. Senior Director of Regulatory System Safety and Passenger Operations, as well as Eric Harvey, Assistant General Counsel, Policy and Legislative Affairs. From Metrolinx, I have Phil Verster, President and Chief Executive Officer, joining us by video conference. And finally, from Railway Association of Canada, I have Marc Brazeau, President and Chief Executive Officer. Welcome to all of you. And fortunately, I want to share with our witnesses that as a vote has once again been called, it looks like we're only going to be able to give you an opportunity to share your opening remarks with us on the record. And I'm hoping that I get approval from all of you to allow us to submit questions electronically by email, which we can get your responses back in written form for the benefit of our analysts who can include it as testimony. Does that work for you?
Yes.
I'm seeing thumbs up even for Mr. Verster online. Perfect. So do I have unanimous consent to keep going, colleagues? Yes. Yes.
Could I propose an alternative? Instead of having 5-minute opening statements followed by no questions in person, could we ask our witnesses to make shorter opening statements and allow for a 2.5-minute round per member? I think that would allow us to get it done before the vote.
As long as the math works, perhaps we don't allow for opening remarks, and which would have taken 15 minutes, and we allow for one round each for 4 minutes, which is that something that would be beneficial to members?
Yes.
And 12:45 hard stop. I need to abide by that to get my unanimous consent, colleagues.
It doesn't give you that much. Yeah, we want to hear from them.
What's that?
Mr. Chair,
Do it as you propose.
what I would recommend is that we give them the time. So we can always submit questions after, as you mentioned earlier, we can submit questions after the fact, but let's give them the floor and you guys, it's your show.
Okay, it looks like the only way I'm getting unanimous consent is by allowing you, our witnesses, to provide your opening remarks, and then we, as members, will submit questions electronically, and we very much appreciate your time in providing us with those answers. So we'll begin with Mr. TRAN. Mr. TRAN, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Or is it Mr. Harvey?
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Harvey, there you go.
Thank you. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président et honorable membre du comité.
Hello, Chair and members of the committee. We thank you for inviting us to talk about the high-frequency train. CN is the largest railway in Canada and transports more than 300 million tons of freight per year, over 30,000 kilometers of railway covering Canada and the central U.S. And we have a mandate to support Canada's economy by shipping freight in a safe and efficient way toward our markets and clients. We have origins and destinations in a large number of your ridings, and it's essential to day-to-day life, whether it be cars, clothing, food, or raw materials. And a large part of the freight that we transport is for exports to support Canada's economy. We acknowledge the importance of freight transportation by rail for Canada's trade balance, and we thank our customers for their trust. Canada's railways that transport merchandise are the owners of their corridors, infrastructures, and rolling stock. Are also responsible for their maintenance. Canada's railways have to invest massively to increase their capacity in order to fulfill the growing demand from their customers, thereby supporting the economic growth and employment. To illustrate this growth, in 1994, the last year before privatization of CN, we transported 2.3 million train cars originating in Canada. In recent years, this figure has risen to 3.5 million train cars, representing a growth of nearly 55%. CN's current network is very different from what it was before privatization. CN had to invest massively to support this growth and support the economy. We like to emphasize that CN invested $3.2 billion last year, or 19% of its gross revenues, to maintain its network and increase capacity, but sustained demand for freight transport is such that some parts of the supply chain are at or nearly at full capacity.
Simply put, Canadian Railways cannot say no and must, without delay and with due care and diligence, receive, carry, and deliver the traffic. Here, the Act refers to the freight traffic tendered to railways. Some of our customers have certainly engaged with you to express the need for more rapid growth or for more service. Recent years have been challenging for the Canadian supply chain. Major and unpredicted variations in demand are part of the new reality that we must collectively deal with. Importantly, this requires network capacity to adjust when needed. Since the privatization of CN in 1995, VIA has operated on CN's network under a train service agreement. Nearly 85% of VIA's current service operates on CN's network. This represents for CN a significant commitment. The coordination of both freight and passenger service presents a sustained challenge. Our freight service has a maximum speed of 55 miles per hour, while VIA operates in some segments of our network at 100 miles per hour. We have two additional comments. First, increased demand for our freight service is causing more operational conflicts with VIA's. Nevertheless, we do our best to accommodate VIA's operations, understanding that it's not always possible to do so exactly as VIA would want. Second, asking one freight railway company to host 85% of the passenger service, while its direct competitor only provides a marginal contribution to that passenger service, creates an imbalance that must end. Last September, representatives of HFR appeared before you and explained that their project involves a corridor dedicated to passenger service. The stated purpose is to ensure the long-term viability of both passenger and freight service by removing the inefficiencies and complexities of having both types of trains operating on the same tracks. CN totally agrees with this critical aspect of the project and supports the establishment of a corridor dedicated to passenger service. We welcome HFR's approach in recognizing the importance of protecting the railway freight capacity for the growth of the Canadian economy. At CN, we believe that the Canadian vision for rail transportation should be one where both freight and passenger services can deliver on their respective mandates, including enabling their respective growth. This is why we believe that the HFR proposal has many of the right features to provide the long-term rail capacity Canada needs. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Harvey. Next, prochainement.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. Next, we have Mr. Verster. Mr. Verster, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. We've got an extensive program of improvement of our GO network, which will be a multi-billion-dollar project with lots of construction that would increase the capacity of our network by a factor of around 3 in terms of ridership. So that's a significant improvement in capacity. And we have for years now, since 2020, worked closely with VIA HFR to make sure that the infrastructure we're building and the services we're planning will be capable of accommodating VIA. To give you just a broad number to mentally picture, Union Station, in the busiest hour of the peak, we can currently take 36 trains per hour, and our capacity increases will take that to 80 trains per hour. And all of our planning incorporates keeping a capacity and footprint for VIA in that design and operation. Just a topical item of this conversation, the thought I'd like to leave with you is that whatever you decide on and whatever the strategy is for implementing VIA HFR, it has to be driven by an obsession with what is the customer base you're trying to serve, rather than start off with what's the infrastructure solution and compare really your needs to service customers and secure revenue as the driving force for the infrastructure choices that will have to follow afterwards. Just want to give a sense that the Class 1 freight operators, CN and CP, are integral partners for Metrolinx. We work with these two organizations continuously. They are hugely committed to moving both freight and passengers. And no matter what the operational or commercial issue is, we always find a way forward with them. And therefore, I'll give you another sense in terms of punctuality and services. We have consistently improved our punctuality across our network over the last couple of years, and that our trains run over CN track as well as CPKC track. But we own 80% or 85% of our network, and our punctuality is around 96, 97% for our services. And we run Obviously, we run already on Lakeshore East and Lakeshore West, high-frequency regular services. Just want to have a last thought with the committee and say the type of product that HFR can be, could be, if it's driven by an understanding of what are the real customer markets that we are serving, can contribute significantly to the economy of Canada. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verster. Next, we have Mr. Brazeau. Mr. Brazeau, la parole est à vous. Vous avez 5 minutes.
Mr. Brazeau, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Canada's Railway Association would represent various railways, Metro Links, and tourism ones such as Rocky Mountain Air and the Charlevoix train. And we represent also railways of Class 1 such as CN and CPKC, and short lines such as SRY in BC and QNSL in Quebec and Labrador. Every year, Canada's railways move millions of people and $380 billion worth of goods, including half of Canada's exports. Rail is the safest and greenest mode of ground transportation, and railways continue to play an important role as a motive force for Canada. Dedicated tracks for passengers and freight are required for Canada to have the rail capacity needed for the growth of these two sectors. Any passenger service proposal must demonstrate that freight capacity to handle current and future anticipated volumes can be preserved. Otherwise, we are not supporting Canada's economy. Shippers that depend on freight capacity to move resources to communities, international markets, and communities that depend on the rail for essential goods. Canada was built by rail. With proper planning, consultation, and strategic decision-making and execution, Canada can continue to build and grow by rail. Historical context is important. The story of passenger rail is older than Confederation. Railways fueled the growth of cities in the east and led to the founding of urban centers in the west. After dominating land transportation from mid-19th century to early 20th century, passenger rail ridership fell in the 1940s and 50s as travel by cars and planes became more economical. In the mid-1970s, passenger rail across many parts of Canada's vast geography was no longer economically viable. To prevent its disappearance and to provide a basic level of intercity passenger rail service, the federal government created Via Rail as a Crown corporation in 1977. Via trains were to run on private freight railway tracks under negotiated track access agreements.
The federal government rationalized Via's route network in the 1990s. The routes eliminated were primarily on the former CP network. Today, Via operates almost exclusively on CN track. Via ridership displayed healthy growth in the years leading up to the pandemic. Ridership volumes are recovering strongly from pandemic lows. While passenger ridership grows, Canada's exporters and producers need freight rail services more than ever. Freight rail traffic, along with Canada's GDP, has roughly doubled over the past 3 decades, and freight demand is only expected to increase. Freight railways are investing billions of dollars every year to meet that demand safely and efficiently. Any constraint on the ability of freight railways to meet customer demand would directly limit Canada's current and future GDP. We must therefore ensure that passenger rail and freight rail can continue to grow and flourish in Canada, in and outside of the Toronto-Quebec City corridor. If Canada is serious about advancing high-frequency rail, dedicated tracks are not a nice-to-have, but a must-have. And it must be done in a way that fully protects the freight capacity needed for today and the physical space needed to accommodate future growth. Passenger rail, just like freight, must be set up for long-term success. Without growing rail capacity, both passenger and freight, we face a future of higher emissions and more congestions on publicly funded roads. dedicated passenger rail tracks in densely populated economic regions at this important juncture in Canada's history are necessary. This must be done strategically, in close consultation with all stakeholders and rail experts with both passenger and freight backgrounds. This committee and all involved must carefully consider complex issues like grade separation, crossing safety, track differences, technology, and infrastructure consideration, amongst others. First mile, last mile connections, multimodal integration are critical. There is a high degree of complexity in urban centers at places like Toronto's Union Station and Montreal's Gare Centrale. But we are a country that has built big things before, and we can do it again. Investing in dedicated tracks for passenger rail in the corridor will mean accessibility, economic and environmental, and most importantly, safety benefits. Mr. Chair, Canada's population is expected to grow by 14 million by the year 2100. We must make wise, informed, and inspired choices now. Anything less than dedicated tracks will hold Canada back at a time when we must be moving people and goods, our economy, and our country forward. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Berezo, and I'd like to
Thank you,
all
Mr. Brazeau.
for being here and, of course, for their patience and understanding with the parliamentary process. I'm going to invite all members, if there are any questions that you may have for these witnesses, please submit them to myself or the clerk, and we will make sure to get those to our witnesses and include the responses to what we submit to the analysts. With that, this meeting is adjourned.